The bell above the cafe door jingled as Karoline Reavitt stepped inside, brushing a few snowflakes from her coat. The warmth of freshly brewed coffee and baked bread filled the air, a stark contrast to the crisp winter cold outside. It was a small-town cafe, the kind with handwritten menus on the wall and a glass case full of homemade pies. She hadn't planned on stopping, just a quick coffee before heading back on the road. Then she saw her. Behind the counter, balancing a tray of steaming mugs, was an elderly woman, her silver hair tied back in a loose bun. She moved slowly, carefully, her hands trembling just slightly, as she set the tray down on a nearby table. Recognition hit like a punch to the chest. Margaret Maggie Turner. Karoline blinked, stunned. She had known Maggie since she was a baby. The woman had practically raised her. Long nights when Karoline was sick, warm cookies after school, whispered lullabies when nightmares crept in. Maggie had been more than a nanny. She had been family. And yet here she was, 85 years old, still working. For a long moment, Karoline just watched, a mix of nostalgia and unease bubbling up inside her. Why was Maggie here? Why wasn't she retired, enjoying life? The tray wobbled, a teacup tilted too far, teetering on the edge. Instinct kicked in. "Maggie!" Karoline's voice cut through the cafe's low hum. The elderly woman froze, her eyes flickering toward the sound. A moment of confusion, then a sharp inhale, and suddenly recognition bloomed across Maggie's face. Karoline? Her voice was softer than she remembered, thinner, but still filled with warmth. Karoline smiled, moving toward the counter. "It's me," she said. Maggie's lips trembled as she set the tray down, pressing a frail hand to her chest. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Look at you, all grown up." She reached for Karoline's hands, squeezing them tight. But behind the joy in her eyes, Karoline saw something else. Relief, maybe even embarrassment. Something wasn't right, and Karoline was about to find out why. They sat in a corner booth near the window, away from prying eyes. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily past streetlights, the evening rush slowing to a peaceful lull. Karoline wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee, its warmth doing little to ease the tightness in her chest. Maggie smiled, but there was something fragile about it, something forced. "I can't believe it's you," she said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into her tea. "I still remember when you were knee-high, running around the house, always getting into something." Karoline had chuckled, but the nostalgia only made the moment heavier. She had so many memories of Maggie, but none of them involved her working at a cafe, struggling to carry trays at 85. "Why are you still working, Maggie?" she asked gently. Maggie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the ceramic cup. "Oh, you know how it is," she said lightly. "Gotta keep busy. Can't sit around all day doing nothing." But Karoline wasn't buying it. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Maggie." A pause. The old woman sighed, setting her spoon down with a soft clink. When she looked up, her eyes held something raw, something unspoken. "Truth is," Maggie murmured, "I never had much saved. Your parents paid me well, don't get me wrong, but I never put much away. Always thought there'd be time for that later." She gave a sad little chuckle. "Then life happened. My pension isn't much and, well, doctor's bills don't pay themselves." The words landed like a punch. Karoline swallowed hard. "You mean you—" Maggie waved a hand dismissively. "It's fine, really. I get by. The folks here are kind. Let me take extra shifts when I need them." Extra shifts. At 85. Karoline felt something sharp twist in her stomach. She had spent years climbing the ladder of success, attending galas, shaking hands with world leaders, and all that time, the woman who had raised her had been struggling, alone. Guilt settled like a stone in her chest. Maggie reached across the table, patting Karoline's hand. "Don't look like that, sweetheart. I've had a good life. You don't owe me anything." But Karoline wasn't so sure about that. She had let Maggie down once. She wouldn't do it again. Karolina sat in her car outside the cafe long after Maggie had gone back to work, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The world outside moved on. The faint hum of cars passing, the occasional flicker of holiday lights in nearby storefronts, but Karoline felt frozen, stuck in a place she hadn't visited in years. Memories flooded back, unbidden and relentless. She saw herself as a child, curled up in bed, feverish and whimpering. It wasn't her mother who stayed up all night with a cold cloth pressed to her forehead. It wasn't her father who whispered lullabies until she drifted back to sleep. It was Maggie. She remembered scraped knees and bedtime stories, fresh baked cookies waiting after school. She remembered Maggie smoothing down her hair before big events, the way her presence alone had been enough to make Karoline feel safe. Maggie had spent years taking care of her every need, her every heartbreak, her every triumph. And now, at 85, who was taking care of Maggie? The answer sat heavy in her chest. No one. Karoline pressed her fingers to her temple, guilt gnawing at her insides. She had been so caught up in building her career, in standing on podiums and shaking hands with politicians, that she had let time slip through her fingers. She had let Maggie slip through her fingers. Not anymore. Karoline inhaled sharply, grabbing her phone. A quick search, a few calls, retirement homes, medical care, financial assistance. There had to be a way to fix this. She wasn't just going to watch Maggie work herself to exhaustion, not when she had the means to change it. But Maggie was stubborn. She always had been. This wasn't just about helping her, it was about making her accept help. The next morning, Karoline returned to the cafe, waiting until Maggie's shift ended. The older woman was exhausted, rubbing her sore back as she untied her apron. Karoline stepped forward. "Maggie," she said softly. Maggie smiled, weary but warm. "You're back already, sweetheart?" Karoline nodded, heart hammering. "I need to ask you something." Maggie tilted her head. "What is it? Would you ever consider retiring?" Maggie blinked. Then, to Karoline's surprise, she laughed. "Oh, honey," Maggie chuckled, shaking her head. "Retirement isn't for women like me." Karoline frowned. "And what kind of woman is that?" "The kind who doesn't sit around waiting for life to pass by." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron, setting it aside. "I've worked since I was a girl, Karoline. Taking care of your family, then other families, then this cafe. It's just what I do." Karoline unfolded her arms. "It's what you had to do, but you shouldn't have to anymore." Maggie smiled, but it was the kind that softened bad news, the kind that meant she wasn't budging. "I appreciate the thought, sweetheart, but I don't need charity." Karoline exhaled, studying her. She had expected this, the stubbornness, the pride. Maggie had always been independent, always put everyone else first. She needed a different approach. "Good," Karoline said smoothly, "because I'm not offering charity." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "No?" "No." Karoline leaned forward. "I'm offering you a job." That got Maggie's attention. She gave a skeptical smirk. "A job? At my age?" Karoline nodded. "I need someone I trust, someone I can count on. You always said you wanted to stay busy. Well, I have the perfect way for you to do that." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "And what exactly would this job be?" Karoline grinned, folding her arms. "You'll see." Maggie huffed, shaking her head with amusement. "You always were a handful." "And you always were my favorite person," Karoline countered. Maggie sighed, rubbing her hands together. "I don't know, Karoline." Karoline softened. "Just trust me. Take a few days off. Rest. Let me handle everything." A pause. Maggie stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to read something in her expression. Then finally she nodded. "All right," Maggie said. "I'll trust you." Karoline smiled. She had no idea what was coming next. Karoline wasn't the kind of woman who made empty promises. When she said she was going to take care of something, she took care of it. The moment Maggie agreed to take a few days off, Karoline got to work. Sitting in her hotel room, she flipped open her laptop and pulled out a notepad, pen tapping against the paper as she made a list. Maggie wouldn't accept outright charity, which meant Karoline had to be strategic. This wasn't about handouts, it was about making sure Maggie had everything she deserved. First, the financial situation. A few calls to some contacts in banking and legal services revealed the harsh truth. Maggie's house was in bad shape, not just physically but financially. The property taxes had piled up, and she had taken out a second mortgage years ago that she was still struggling to pay off. If nothing changed, she'd lose the home within the year. Karoline set down her pen, her jaw tightening. That wasn't happening. Next, her health. Karoline reached out to a private physician, arranging a full medical checkup. Maggie might say she was fine, but Karoline had seen the way she rubbed her aching back, the slight tremor in her hands. She needed care, and she needed it soon. Finally, the solution. Karoline knew that handing Maggie a pile of cash wouldn't work. She needed something that felt like a gift, not a favor. Something Maggie could accept with pride. And that's when the idea hit her. Karoline picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "I need to buy a house," she said, skipping the pleasantries, "and it needs to be perfect." She wouldn't let Maggie lose everything she had, not on her watch. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the deal was done. The papers were signed. The keys were in her hand. Now all she had to do was get Maggie to see it, and when she did, it would change everything. The car ride was quiet at first. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, bundled in a thick sweater, watching the snowy landscape pass by. Karoline stole glances at her now and then, but Maggie didn't ask where they were going. She trusted Karoline. As they pulled off the main road onto a long, winding driveway, Maggie finally spoke. "Where in the world are we, sweetheart?" Karoline smiled. "Just a little place I wanted to show you." Maggie's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. The car came to a slow stop in front of a charming cottage by the lake. It was small but beautiful. White walls, a sloped roof, smoke already curling from the chimney. The sun reflected off the frozen lake nearby, making the world shimmer. Maggie stared. "Oh my," she breathed. Karoline stepped out and walked around to open Maggie's door. "Come on," she urged, holding out her hand. Maggie followed, still looking around in awe. The porch steps creaked slightly as they stepped up, and Karoline pushed open the front door. Inside, it was warm and inviting. A cozy fireplace crackled in the living room. A soft couch sat against the wall, a quilt folded neatly over its back. The kitchen was small but pristine, the wooden table already set with 2 cups of tea. It smelled like home. Maggie's fingers brushed over the counter. "This place is lovely," she murmured. "But why?" Karoline reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small set of keys. Maggie's eyes flicked to them, then back to Karoline. Karoline placed them gently in Maggie's palm. "This is yours." Silence. Maggie blinked down at the keys, then back at the house. "Karoline," her voice wavered. No, this isn't..." Karoline stepped closer, taking Maggie's free hand. "You took care of me," she said softly. "Now let me take care of you." Maggie's lips parted, but no words came, just the shimmer of tears forming in her tired eyes. She had spent a lifetime giving. For the first time, someone was giving back, and this time she wouldn't have to say no. For the first few days, Maggie walked through the cottage like a visitor, not a homeowner. She ran her fingers along the bookshelves, straightened already neat cushions, peeked out the window at the frozen lake, as if expecting someone to tell her she didn't belong. She even tried to make herself useful, offering to cook, asking if Karoline needed anything, checking for things that didn't need fixing. But slowly, something changed. One morning, Karoline found Maggie sitting in the sunroom with a blanket over her lap, staring out at the lake with a soft smile on her lips. The look wasn't one of worry or hesitation. It was peace. That was when Karoline knew Maggie was finally allowing herself to accept the gift. But Karoline wasn't done. The cottage was just the beginning. While Maggie settled in, Karoline worked behind the scenes. She met with doctors, arranging a full medical plan, so Maggie would never have to stress about hospital bills or prescription costs again. She hired a full-time caretaker, not a nurse but a companion, someone who would help Maggie with errands, cook meals when she didn't feel like it, and most importantly, be there, so she would never be alone. And then, the final piece. A fund set up in Maggie's name, ensuring she'd never have to worry about money again, enough to cover anything she needed, from groceries to vacations, without her ever feeling like she was taking charity. At first, when Karoline told her, Maggie protested. "Sweetheart, I can't just—" "You can," Karoline said firmly, "and you will." Maggie's lips pressed together, eyes glistening. "I don't know how to thank you." Karoline smiled. "You already did, for my entire life." Word of what Karoline had done spread quickly. Old friends, distant family members, people who had let Maggie slip through the cracks, started reaching out. Some called, others sent letters. Apologies, warm messages, invitations to visit. Maggie at first wasn't sure what to do with it all. But for the first time in years, she wasn't forgotten. And for Karoline, that was the greatest victory of all. Karoline wanted the world to know who Maggie was. She had given her a home, security, and comfort. But there was one last thing she needed to do, give Maggie the recognition she deserved. So Karoline planned one final surprise. Weeks later, Maggie was seated in the front row of a lavish charity gala, dressed in an elegant navy blue gown Karoline had insisted she wear. The room was packed, business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, all in attendance for a night dedicated to honoring caregivers, the quiet heroes of the world. Maggie had no idea she was about to be the centerpiece of it all. Karoline stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. The crowd hushed as she began to speak. "Tonight, I want to tell you about someone who changed my life." She looked toward Maggie, holding her gaze. "A woman who shaped me, who gave me love when I needed it most, who taught me kindness, patience, and what it means to put others before yourself." Maggie's eyes widened. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "She was never in the spotlight. She never asked for credit. But everything I am today is because of her." She turned to the audience. How many of us can say we truly appreciate the people who raised us? The ones who sacrificed quietly, who made our lives better without expecting anything in return? A murmur spread through the room. Some nodded. Others looked thoughtful. Karoline took a deep breath. "That's why tonight I want to recognize one of the greatest women I've ever known." She gestured toward Maggie. "Margaret Turner." The room erupted into applause. Maggie's hands covered her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. She never expected this, not in a million years. Karoline stepped down from the stage, kneeling beside her. "You deserve this," she whispered, squeezing Maggie's hand. Maggie shook her head in disbelief, voice trembling. "I never wanted recognition, sweetheart." Karoline smiled. "I know, that's why you deserve it even more." Moved by the speech, donors pledged thousands of dollars to an initiative Karoline had launched in Maggie's honor, a program providing financial support to struggling caregivers across the country. It wasn't just about Maggie anymore. It was about all the people like her who had given everything and received so little in return. As the night went on, guests approached Maggie, shaking her hand, thanking her, sharing their own stories. For the first time in her life, Maggie was seen. And for Karoline, that was the best gift she could ever give. The lake shimmered in the morning sun, the frost-covered trees casting long shadows across the snowy ground. Maggie sat by the window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, watching the peaceful ripples of water that stretched endlessly before her. For the first time in years, she wasn't worrying about bills, work, or how she'd make it through the next month. For the first time, She was just living. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She already knew who it was before she even stood. "Come in, sweetheart." Karoline stepped inside, shaking the cold from her coat, her smile as warm as ever. "How's my favorite retiree?" Maggie chuckled, setting her cup down. "Still getting used to the title?" Karoline made herself comfortable on the couch, stretching out like she had when she was a kid. They had fallen into a routine, Karoline visiting at least once a week, always bringing some kind of treat from town. Today it was a fresh loaf of cinnamon bread from the bakery. "I still can't believe you did all this," Maggie said, glancing around the cozy home, the shelves lined with books Karoline had filled them with. "I never expected—" She trailed off, shaking her head, as if the words were too big to say out loud. Karoline's expression softened. "You never expected kindness?" Maggie hesitated, then nodded. "Not like this, not from, well, anyone." Karoline leaned forward, placing a hand over Maggie's. "You deserved this all along, Maggie, every bit of it." Maggie squeezed her hand, blinking away the tears threatening to form. "You were always the one taking care of everyone else," Karoline continued. "It was time someone took care of you." Maggie exhaled a shaky breath, then smiled. "Well," she said, "I suppose I'll have to get used to being spoiled." Karoline grinned. "That's the plan." As the fire crackled softly in the background and the scent of cinnamon filled the air, Maggie knew she was home. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed she belonged there. Karoline knew that Maggie's story wasn't unique. There were thousands, millions of caregivers out there just like her. People who had spent their lives looking after others only to be left forgotten in their later years. And that didn't sit right with Karoline. So she did what she did best. She took action. Within months, Karoline launched the Turner Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting elderly caregivers and former nannies who, like Maggie, had fallen through the cracks. The foundation offered financial aid, housing assistance, medical care, and community programs to ensure that no caregiver was ever left behind again. At first it was small, but then the story went national. News outlets picked it up. Talk shows invited Karoline on to discuss the initiative. Donations poured in from people who had been impacted by their own caregivers, nannies, nurses, grandparents who had given them everything and asked for nothing in return. A movement had begun, and Maggie? She lived to see it all. She spent her final years in comfort, surrounded by people who loved her. Friends, old and new, came to visit often. Letters from strangers arrived in the mail, people thanking her, telling her that her story had changed lives. But no one was by her side more than Karoline. When the time finally came, Maggie passed peacefully in her sleep, wrapped in the very love she had spent her whole life giving to others. At her memorial, Karoline stood before a packed room of people, friends, family, and even some of the caregivers the foundation had helped. She looked out over the crowd and took a deep breath. "Maggie Turner wasn't just my nanny," she said. "She was my family, and because of her, I understand what love, sacrifice, and kindness truly mean." She paused, swallowing back the emotion in her throat. The world is a better place because Maggie was in it, and through this foundation, through the lives she's touched, her kindness will never be forgotten. The applause was thunderous, but Karoline wasn't thinking about the crowd. She was thinking about the woman who had given her everything, and knowing without a doubt that she had finally given something back. The legacy of kindness would live on. And it all started with Maggie. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.